How did the Cold War define and shape American art and intellectual life? Louis Menand will be here to talk about his new book, The Free World. What makes for a great American essay? Philip Lopate will join us to talk about his anthologies, The Glorious American Essay and The Golden Age of the American Essay. Elizabeth Harris will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's May 14th. I'm Pamela Paul. Louis Menand joins us now from Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is the author of The Metaphysical Club, and his newest book is called The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War. Luke, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you are actually in the Widener Library at Harvard University as we speak.
That's correct. Yes, I'm in the office in the stacks in which I wrote the entire book. And I don't think I could have written the book if I hadn't had access to these incredible library resources at Harvard.
How long did you spend researching the book? Do you tend to do all of your research and then begin writing, or do you do both as you go along?
I spent about 10 years on the book, and I do research for each chapter, and then I write that chapter, and then I move on to the next chapter. So each chapter took a long time to do because I wanted to do a fair amount of research to get a feel for the period and a feel for what other people had written about it.
So you had this all outlined then, presumably, before you began writing?
No. The only thing I had outlined was I knew where I wanted to begin, which is 1945 at the end of the Second World War. And then I knew the finish line was 1965, which is the year the United States intervened militarily in South Vietnam. So those were the sort of the bookends of the book. And then I kind of followed my nose through the period just to sort of see where it was going. At a certain point, as you approach the horizon that you set for yourself, 1965, you begin to see something happening that you want to capture. So I didn't start out with a thesis exactly. I just wanted to tell the story as it unfolded historically. And then I discovered in doing that what the trend lines were, and then I tried to sort of hit on those as I was going through it. But each chapter is sort of a separate book in a way. It takes up a different subject, a different figure, a different movement, and tries to sort of, encapsulate what that's all about, and then moves on to another one.
All right, I want to get back to what that story is, but I want to stay for a moment on the dates because the subtitle of your book is obviously Art and Thought in the Cold War, and the Cold War, of course, went on after 1965. So how did you choose that as a cutoff?
Well, it goes on till 1990, really, which is when the Soviet Union voted itself out of existence, and, of course, the Velvet Revolution of 1989. But when people write about the Cold War period, when they talk about things like the Cold War University or Cold War liberalism, they're usually talking about the first 20 years because that's the period when the Cold War is sort of on the front burner in American politics, right through the Kennedy administration. And, of course, Vietnam continues that. So I felt that this was a discrete period, and there's a sort of second half of the Cold War that would require another book, which I did not want to write.
And you said earlier that you didn't know what the themes would be, that those emerged from the story that you wanted to tell. What was that story beyond the framework of that 20-year period?
I knew, or I had in my head, the idea that this is a period of social change because it's the period of the civil rights movement and then the women's movement. So I captured both of those in this 20-year period. And I also knew it was a period in which American intellectuals and educated consumers of cultural goods widened the horizon of what they were interested in experiencing to include Hollywood movies and popular music and so forth. And that the obsession with highbrow and lowbrow, which characterizes the earlier period, goes away in the mid-'60s. So I knew those were things I was looking at. But what I didn't get right away was, the extent to which what happened in American culture, both at the level of avant-garde art, like John Cage's music, and at the level of Hollywood movies, was influenced by countries around the world. That it was actually, this culture was actually created by kind of global cultural interchange or exchange. And I realized that was a key part of the story. And the second part of the story was that when this happens, when American culture kind of comes into its own, Because before 1945, I think nobody really thought of America as a central player in world culture. That changes in the 60s. But when that happens, culture becomes global, becomes international. So that when you get to 1965, you sort of recognize the world that we're in today, in which culture circulates globally, but all circulates through New York and Los Angeles. And that's kind of what happens in this period. So I thought it was a very exciting period of social change and a very exciting period of cultural change.
I want to go back to your previous book and how you got from the Metaphysical Club, which won the Pulitzer Prize, to this book, because there's a leap, obviously, in period. And if this was kind of the obvious next book for you to write, or if you had some other intention.
I didn't think of it as a sequel to that book. So the Metaphysical Club, as you said, takes up the period from the Civil War to the end of the First World War, and it's about the philosophy known as pragmatism. That book is a very U.S.-centric book. All the pragmatists, William James, John Dewey, and so forth, were influenced by European scientists and philosophers, but the book really focuses on what was going on in the United States. So it's actually quite different in terms of how I oriented myself around the subject. And then I don't think of this book as particularly following up on that book, but I use the same methodology I used in that book, which is to combine biography and social history with kind of a conceptual understanding of people's ideas about what they were doing. That's just my method as an historian. But my interest in the period really was independent of the work on that book, which is, historical period, because I grew up in the 60s and I was very interested and always interested in that period because it's a great period of magazine journalism, and I wanted to be a magazine journalist. So I read all those magazine writers and new journalists and so forth, just for my own pleasure and instruction. And then gradually I began to see that there were other things going on that I wanted to learn more about.
One of the things with the Metaphysical Club is that it was fairly narrow in focus and that you were really writing about 4 key figures and a very distinct school of thought. This is a much broader canvas, and I'm curious how you narrowed the focus for yourself. You're talking about visual art, about music, both popular and experimental. You have obviously criticism in here. You talk about Pauline Kael and Dwight MacDonald and Lionel Trilling. You have literature, Hollywood. Was there anywhere where you didn't go, or did you allow yourself to roam as freely as you wanted?
Part of the problem, in a way, that you're raising with these questions is that there isn't really one group of people or one school of thought that explains what's going on in the period. I figured that out pretty quickly. Then I had to decide what was sort of the clothesline, so to speak, I was going to hang all my stories on. And I felt it had to be what I said, which is this sort of gradual cultural awakening and opening up combined with social change, which also was a kind of opening up of American society. And that was really the story, but that there wasn't one figure or one set of related figures that you could tell that story with. And also, as I said, because so much of it is international that you have to jump around quite a bit. So what I did was that I wrote the first chapter, which is on George Kennan and containment theory and theory of international relations that comes from. And then it's like stretching the canvas when you write the first chapter. And I remember I finished the first chapter and I went, oh my God, this is going to be a very big canvas. So I realized since I couldn't include everything in the book, I had to be selective because I wanted to do a pretty in-depth analysis of each figure or each movement that I wrote about. So the reader got a pretty thorough idea of where these works came from or these ideas came from and what the social context was for them such that they emerged when they did and so on. So I was looking for what would be the next chapter. When I finished the Kennan chapter, I wrote a chapter on Orwell because he seemed like logically I had to write about 1984, and then a chapter on existentialism because that's also a late 40s phenomenon. And then at some point I just thought this has to come next. I didn't really have all the chapters planned out until I got partway into the book. But I began to see, as I said, once I saw how the story was shaping up, then I saw what I needed to cover. But there's a ton of stuff left out. In fact, everybody looks at the book and says, why didn't you write about this or why didn't you write about that? Because I couldn't write about all of it because of the way I wanted to do it. Another way to say it is that I didn't want to do a survey at 30,000 feet of a 20-year period in all these different media. It was just I think it would be boring and also impossible to do from my point of view. So what I wanted to do was to look closely at what's happening on the ground, what it looked like when Jackson Pollock decided to do the drip paintings. Well, what did the world look like to him? It didn't look like anything from 30,000 feet. It looked like very day to day. That's how most art gets created. They're not thinking, where's the paradigm going or what's happening with, social change. They're thinking, how can I make a painting? How can I write a poem?
Many of the figures that you write about are obviously significant, well-known figures that have been written about a lot. George Kennan, you mentioned, James Baldwin, Susan Sontag, Jackson Pollock. Can you talk about some of the maybe lesser known or more forgotten figures of this period that you wanted to write about that you see as significant?
One of the things that I did when deciding how to organize the book was to decided to pick certain figures as kind of tent poles for each chapter. So Baldwin, Pollock, Sartre, and so on. And to focus on them, and then figures in their surround when they were writing their books or painting their paintings or whatever, figures in their surround that were part of the world that they operated in. And I have to say that I discovered hundreds of such figures, or I learned more about hundreds of such figures who really aren't that well known today, but in the day they were part of the scene that Pollock or whoever was working in. And I tried to capture as much of that as I could in the book. Historians call it stray voltage. It's the kind of stuff that doesn't really fit into the pattern, but it's part of the world, the way it looks to the particular figure you're writing about. So there's lots of such people in the book. And there's also people who sort of, I think, normally in the book that normally don't get included in stories. For example, with Baldwin. One of the fascinating things about Baldwin, I found Baldwin incredibly complicated person to write about, but I learned a lot because he's very mercurial character, and it's hard to anticipate what his next move is going to be or what he's going to say next. And sometimes it seems like he's saying something that's going to get him into trouble, but it's not really. He's sort of pushing the ball forward. And then he has a very complicated relationship to American life, obviously. He's very critical of it. At the same time, he admires Martin Luther King Jr. He becomes a spokesperson for the civil rights movement. And then because of the line he took on American race relations, which is very similar to the line of Black Lives Matter protesters today, was to say white liberals have to own their own part in the regime of white supremacy. And white liberals in 1960 did not want to hear that. And he stuck to that line, which we honor today, but in the early 60s, it was very problematic, and they marginalized him, really. So that was fascinating to me. I didn't know all of that at that level of detail. So what I was going to say, one of the interesting things about him is that he spent 7 years in France, and this was between about 1949 and 1956, and those years were years when France was undergoing the stress of decolonization, particularly with two former colonies, Indochina and Algeria. So that's all French intellectuals were talking about. And a lot of people from these new countries in Africa and South Asia and so forth came to France, and also the Caribbean, former colonies, came to France and would debate the issues of decolonization. Baldwin was exposed to all of that. So when he comes back to the United States, he has a very different understanding of what's going on from a lot of American civil rights people, because he sees the international context for this. He's been exposed to that in Paris. So I also wanted to capture that, and that involved talking about a lot of people who, like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, who, of course, much written about as well, but not necessarily in the context of American civil rights.
You mentioned earlier that two of the obvious forces of change during this period were the civil rights movement and the women's movement. So I'm interested in the title again, The Free World, obviously, within the context of the Cold War. We know what that means. But in the context of American society and culture, it wasn't exactly free for everyone, of course.
No, it wasn't. But I think one of the things that happens in the Cold War is that because, let's just take the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration was not interested in civil rights. It's true that when John Kennedy was a candidate, he loosely associated himself with King, and he needed the black vote to get elected, actually, but he didn't really address civil rights at all in his inaugural address, and he didn't really think it was a priority. But what he realized was that the Soviet Union was using the state of American race relations as propaganda. Because if we're saying to the world, we represent the free world, and we keep a large percentage of our population in this kind of subordinate status, legally through laws, then we look like hypocrites. And then secondly, the fact of decolonization, which I think is the big story in this period. Because remember, the high point of European imperialism is 1939, when European nations dominated about 40% of the Earth's surface. Those colonies all turned into independent states by 1970, almost all of them. So there's a huge change in the international map. The United States wants to be on the side of these new liberation movements, these new independence movements, these new sovereign states, former colonial states. So it doesn't look like we're on their side if we're subordinating non-white persons here. So the civil rights piece, I think, I'm not the only scholar who said this, it's very much motivated by the geopolitics of the period, which gets Kennedy to realize that civil rights is a foreign policy problem. And then he starts to address it. But I don't think without that pressure of the geopolitical situation, I'm not sure the American government would have moved as aggressively as it did when it finally passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
I want to look at one cultural event, if you could call it that you write about in the book through the lens of women's rights and how things have changed from this period to today. So remind us, for those who are not familiar with what happened when Norman Mailer stabbed his wife nearly to death, and sort of the reaction in society and in the culture and his career maybe subsequently, and maybe contrast that with a more recent event, which was what happened with Blake Bailey and accusations against Blake Bailey in the wake of his biography of Philip Roth.
I knew that was coming. Yeah. So I think people who know anything about Mailer's life know that he stabbed his second wife, Adele, at a big party they were having in their apartment. This is in 1960, in the fall of 1960. And what I hadn't realized, I of course knew the story, but what I hadn't realized was, A, he almost killed her because he stabbed her twice, but once was near the heart, and it pierced the membrane around the heart, and she was in surgery for a long time to save her life. So he came very close to killing his wife. And the second thing, which I didn't realize, which is kind of amazing, is that most people felt it was her fault. I say most people in the New York intellectual world who were friends of the Mailers. They felt she had goaded him, that she deserved it, that he was acting out a sort of desperation, that it was a dark night of the soul, and so forth. Almost nobody, there's a few exceptions, whom I mentioned in the book, almost nobody sided with her or thought that he was a wife abuser.
Right, that she had interfered with the artist and his art.
Yeah, that he needed to break free of this terrible marriage or whatever it was, but it was incredible. I mean, these are people, quite well-known people, were saying this, not just saying it among themselves, but they were saying it in print. So there was a kind of, after he got out of, he was in Bellevue for a while, and then of course he had to deal with the legal things, but he never went to jail. People started writing letters to like Time magazine saying, we think Mailer's a great artist, I hope this doesn't get in the way of people's appreciation of his work. Then the most incredible thing is, in 1960, so this is 1960, 1965, he publishes a novel called An American Dream, in which the protagonist kills his wife and throws her out the window of an apartment building. After he kills her, he goes downstairs and has sex with her maid. And then the police sort of get onto him, but he escapes and nothing happens to him. And I read all the reviews. None of them mentioned that this book about a man who kills his wife and gets away with it was written by a man who almost killed his wife and got away with it. So it's just...
I'm nervous to look up the New York Times book review.
Yeah, it's true. I can't remember who wrote that one. But yeah, no, they don't. I think Time magazine mentioned the stabbing in passing, but nobody makes a big deal about it. Most of them don't mention it at all. So to compare to today, yeah, I think that the reaction would be quite different. But it takes us back to the pre-women's movement era. Even intellectuals and liberals and so forth had this very backwards idea about gender. And so 3 years later, Betty Friedan writes The Feminine Mystique, and that suddenly unleashes this pent-up frustration on the part of all these women, mainly white women, who realize that they're also being subordinated and treated as second-class citizens, including, I have to say, at the New York Times, and I have all the statistics about women at the New York Times in that period. It's astonishing. So 1963, when Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique, all the major women's magazines are edited by men. And you just go down the list. There's almost no women in Congress. There's almost no women ambassadors, judges. I mean, women are completely shut out of public life. And even when you look at the cultural world, women are largely ignored. So a lot of great painters from the early 1950s, late 1940s, who were women, just get completely ignored in books written by men about the abstract expressionists.
So you write about a number of art movements that push the boundaries, writers like James Baldwin, obviously talked about Betty Friedan and change there. It's interesting because the common conception, right, of the immediate post-war period, at least, is one of total conformity and blandness. Is that just completely wrong?
It's not completely wrong, but I think when you start looking at what people are doing in the art world, it's not conformist at all. When Jackson Pollock starts doing the drip paintings, that's a radical way of painting for lots of reasons, not just because of the method. He's saying the canvas is no longer a window that I put onto the easel and I see through the canvas, so to speak, to what I'm trying to represent. I'm not interested in that kind of art at all. And to demonstrate that I'm not interested in easel painting, I'm going to put the canvas on the floor where it can't be a window onto anything. And then it becomes about the paint and the canvas. That's a very radical thing, too. This is 1947. When John Cage starts to compose avant-garde music using chance methods, so he flips coins or he uses the I Ching or tarot cards or something like that, that's also 1949, 1950. So there's lots of things going on. Robert Rauschenberg starts painting his stuff. He's a very advanced painter in 1951, 1952. There's a lot of stuff going on that is important, and we know about it, but somehow we think of this period as a bland period in which nothing exciting is happening. Now, it is true at the same time that a lot of people are obsessed with the dangers of social conformity. The most famous of those is David Reisman, who publishes The Lonely Crowd in 1950, and that book is read as a critique of the conformist mentality of post-war American life. I don't think that's exactly what Reisman had in mind when he wrote the book, but that becomes sort of a marker for people when they think about, this is the period of the lonely crowd, this is the period of conformity. No doubt they were picking up on something that's real, but I think in the art world, I don't see that really at all. The artists have to fight against an establishment opinion that's skeptical of avant-garde art, but they win.
I want to stay on this point of conformity versus freedom and make another contemporary comparison. Do you think that this period was more open to new ideas than the world on campus, the world of ideas today? There are lots of people saying that people are worried about freedom of speech on campus, that you can't say what you really think. How does this earlier period compare with the atmosphere around ideas and speech on campus today?
So looking back in history, we can see that people are always trying to silence or censor artistic and political expressions that they don't like. There's always pushback. That's just part of how cultures operate. One of the things you can see in my book is how the zone of protected speech was dramatically expanded in the early Cold War period. But that's both artistic expression and political speech, because free expression was a central value in Cold War culture. It's what differentiated us from the communists, and I think it's still valuable today. One of the stories I tell in the book is about the Berkeley free speech movement in 1964, when students occupied the administration building to protest the censorship of political speech on Berkeley campus, and many of those students were leftists. I think it's always a mistake for progressives or people on the left to engage in efforts to suppress speech. Because another thing that history shows us is that what goes around comes around.
One last question. In an interview with The Times a few weeks ago, you gave this great quote, and if only the world worked this way. You said, I want everybody to agree with me. I want to put things so perfectly that no one can disagree. Okay, so let's wave a wand and assume that that's true. What would people come away with thinking after reading this book about this period?
So one of the epigraphs to my book is from Tom Hayden. He says, we are free to the extent that we know what we're about. So in my book, I'm trying to show readers how things really were in those years, who these people really were, what the significance of what they created really was. And I do this just in hopes that the reader can see those things clearly. I'm not trying to approve or disapprove. My job as a writer is to help people think. It is not to tell them what to think.
All right, well, here's to everyone agreeing with you. The book again is called The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War by Louis Menand. Luke, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you.
Tina Jordan joins us now to help us celebrate the 125th anniversary. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So today I'm going to bring you one of my favorite articles, which is from 1914. And the headline is, "Library readers are often frank critics. They have no hesitation in penciling comments, caustic and otherwise, on the pages of the books they read." Now, the article doesn't say which libraries the Times reporter investigated, but here are some of my favorites. The reporter does point out that more people write in fiction than nonfiction, notes that Thomas Hardy and I believe Dickens, for the most part, get kind comments. George Eliot, on the other hand, for example, in Middlemarch, heavens, but this is dry reading. Balzac, our reporter said, quote, "has the wind taken out of his sails by a scrawl on the flyleaf of Cousin Betty, which reads, 'I shall need to be fumigated after this. I shall need to stand out of doors for a week and let the fresh air blow through me,'" which I love. Here is one Thomas Hardy comment, which says this is insufferable rot, which I know will make your hackles rise, Pamela, because it looks like it's about Tessa the D'Urbervilles. Finally, our reporter also notes that the absolute most comments are found in cookbooks, and it gives us a few examples. "Take notice. This recipe is no good. It ought to be scratched out. I made a cake by it, and the cake wouldn't raise. It wasn't fit for a tramp to eat," and so on and so forth.
These are like the Goodreads reviews of its day.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. And might I add, these are in pencil, of course. People didn't write in books in pen. And the reporter talked to a librarian who said, "Look, the practice of spoiling a clean page is to be deprecated, yet how are we going to stop it? Not by means of fines. We've tried that." She says, "But you know, it shows that the readers are interested, and that is what we keep the library open for." There you are.
Wow. It's also like it's like reading mean tweets.
It's exactly like reading mean tweets. I mean, this is insufferable rot.
Yes. People have been jerks for a long time.
That's right.
Tina, very comforting to know. Thanks so much.
Talk to you next week.
Philip Lopate joins us now from Brooklyn. He is the author of many books, including To Show and to Tell, The Craft of Literary Nonfiction, The Art of the Personal Essay, and several essay collections, including Portrait Inside My Head and Portrait of My Body. His new books are a series of anthologies, The Glorious American Essay, 100 Essays from Colonial Times to the Present, and The Golden Age of the American Essay, 1945 to 1970. Philip, thanks so much for being here.
A pleasure.
That was a long list of books, but this is a lot of work, this project. How did this get started, the project on the American Essay?
It started about 5 years ago when I got the idea of doing one book that would be an anthology of the best essays written in the United States. And I read, and eventually I came up with so many essays that it probably would have been 3,000 pages long if the publisher had decided to publish it. And instead, they decided to come out with the first volume, which was The Glorious American Essay. That would be the whole arc of the American Essay, and then do two more volumes that were the spillover from essays that could not be included in the first volume. And the first of these is The Golden Age of the American Essay. And the third one will be the Contemporary American Essay, which will be dedicated to essays written in the 21st century.
Oh, wow. Okay, wait. So you're going to skip from 1970 to 2000.
I'm going to skip that. That's an embarrassment. Yes. But you found me out.
But presumably this started off, as you said, with the intention that it would be a single volume. When did you realize that's not going to happen?
I wheeled in a collection of essays to my publisher. I couldn't take the subway carrying it, so I took a wheelie. And when she saw this massive amount of pages, she said, "Well, it can't be this way, but we'll figure out something." So I decided to go along with their suggestion. But basically, the first volume was kind of the highlights of the American essay.
I want to talk about that second volume more specifically and why that period. But let's start with some very basic questions. What is an essay? I mean, you edited The Art of the Personal Essay, which is an amazing collection. Obviously, there are different kinds of essays. How would you define the essay at its base, and what are the different kinds, and what did you include here?
Well, I would say that the essay is a kind of tracking of one's thoughts. It's an exploration. We know the word essay comes from the French essai, which means an attempt. So it's an experiment. And what I tried to do after writing the Art of the Personal Essay, I began to be much more open to other kinds of essays. And in this particular project, I'm really trying to expand the notion of what an essay is. So I've included essays that are in the form of letters, like Frederick Douglass's letter to his master. I've included essays in the form of sermons, like Jonathan Edwards, the Puritan preacher. I've included essays in the form of rants. I'm just trying to get people to see the essay as occurring in many, many different forms. And so I'm trying to expand the notion of what an essay is. Some people think the essay should never be polemical. Some people think it has to be argumentative. And I've included both kinds of essays. So basically, I'm advocating a kind of big tent of the essay and really trying to expand the notion of what an essay is. I've included speeches, for instance, like Martin Luther King's speech against the Vietnam War or Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. To me, essays are a ubiquitous form, and I don't want to limit where they can occur. So I'm really trying to jettison that notion of the essay as a small, privileged thing and really trying to show that it can occur in so many different forms.
So you actually made this task harder for yourself because it would have been difficult enough, I think, to get an anthology just of essays in that more traditional format, whether it's a personal essay or a critical essay or a persuasive essay.
Yes, and another way that I made it more difficult to myself, which was that I came to the conclusion that in every discipline, there were probably some really good writers. So, in other words, instead of limiting it to the belletristic or the literary essay, I went to fields like theology and included essays by Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr, art criticism, Clement Greenberg, geography, J.B. Jackson, and so on. Every discipline has had great essay writers. And so that was another way in which I gave myself more work.
All right, another very basic question here, and it's one where the answer might seem obvious, but this is an anthology of the American essay. What do we mean by American in this context?
We mean people who lived in America. They didn't have to be born in America, but they lived for a considerable time in America. And so they're not just tourists, they're not just passing through. So basically, they had to either be born in America or to have adopted America as a second country. But there are some cases like Emma Goldman, who basically kicked out of America after she had moved here. But she is still, I consider, an American essayist, and she writes basically in her essay about America.
So you wouldn't include something like de Tocqueville in here?
Originally, I wanted to put de Tocqueville in. I wanted to put Octavio Paz in, but because I had so much material that was strictly American, in the end, I decided not to.
All right, so you did have some criteria for inclusion. What limits did you set yourself?
I had to like the essay for starters. I couldn't put in something because it was important, but I detested it. And there were enough essays that I liked or loved that I didn't have any problem with that. And then
Wait, what's an example of one that is important but you hate it?
I can't think of one right off the bat, but
Oh, very convenient. All right. Maybe we'll come back to that. But go on with the criteria.
in this particular project, I began to see two recurring alternate tracks, which one was the history of the genre of the essay in America, and the other was the history of America as told by essays. Because all of the essays were writing from a particular time and they were reflecting on the issues that were going on at that time. So, in a way, it becomes a kind of a documentary history of America as told by essays.
So much of writing obviously is a product of its time, and things that were very much acceptable, understandable, what was known at the moment might be unacceptable and perhaps even offensive to readers of today. And I'm curious, how did you make those kinds of calls? Did you say, well, look, this is part of our history, ugly as it might be, and we need to represent that moment as it was at that time for readers today to really understand it? Or did you say, you know what, this crosses the line in certain cases, we're not going to include it because it would really not be acceptable to a reader today, whether it's because of the way in which it characterized a historical event that we see differently now, or whether in its treatment of women or of Black Americans? How did you figure that out?
Well, I went close to the edge at times and then tried not to cross it. So, for instance, I have two essays in the golden age of the American essay, one by Vladimir Nabokov about Lolita, and the other by Lionel Trilling, which is an analysis of Lolita. Now, some readers will simply say, Lolita is beyond the pale. We can't accept it. It seems to be a defense of pedophilia. I don't want to hear anything good about it. Others would say, no, Lolita is a literary classic, and of course it belongs. Now, Nabokov himself always insisted that he was not on Humbert Humbert's side. He disliked Humbert Humbert, but he was writing the book out of the joy of invention, you might say. Lionel Trilling, in his very patient, thoughtful way, circles all the issues that are raised by Lolita, takes it seriously, deals with his own ambivalence toward it. So I felt that that was appropriate. In the case of a writer like Norman Mailer, he wrote a very important essay called The White Negro, which I quoted from in the introduction, but did not include because I found that too many of my friends were aghast at this essay and hated it. But I did include another essay by Norman Mailer because I continue to think that he's one of the most important writers of nonfiction in the 20th century.
The first essay in this collection is from 1726, Cotton Mather's of Poetry and of Style. How did you decide when in history to start, and why this essay?
I like the idea of giving the Puritan writers some room, and I felt that in spite of our own ambivalence toward the Puritans, they were very strong writers, and they set a very high bar in terms of nonfiction prose. And it seemed to me a very curious essay by Cotton Mather because he loves poetry, but he is also afraid that poetry is sometimes sinful. Even Homer is sinful. So I thought this was a good way to start. And in fact, it's before the United States even is a country, it's still a colony. But I wanted to show how the Puritans started out in essay writing, you know? That was the form they chose, not poetry or fiction. So they really were the founding principles of our essays. And then I wanted to show how some of the founding fathers, like Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, also specialized in the essay.
All right, I have to ask you this question, which is a little bit inside baseball, but it's one that anyone who is quoting from other people's work beyond sort of fair use or including them wholesale has to ask, which is when you're putting together something like this, you have to deal with issues around rights. Who owns these essays?
Yes,
Was that a logistical nightmare?
it is indeed a logistical nightmare, and it is the one pain in the butt part about doing anthologies is getting permissions. And sometimes it takes a long time, and sometimes you actually can't find out who owns the rights, or they've disappeared in the mists of time, and they're very hard to track down. And I've used a lot of devices to do that. But the most painful part, I have to say, is writing the checks for permissions because they're expected to be paid out of my advance, which isn't always that large. So basically, permissions is a headache of anthologies. The joy is reading the stuff and getting your own knowledge of the field expanded and enlarged.
I bring this up because I don't know if many readers or listeners realize this. I mean, you could end up editing a book like this at a deficit because some writers will charge a lot of money to reprint or reuse their work in someone else's book. And I know that there are cases in which people will decide, I'm not going to include this because it's just too expensive. Did you have to leave anything out, whether because of logistics or price?
I left one or two things out, but I also wrote a lot of begging letters. This is a genre, the begging letter, that I feel I've become the master of, you know. I've written so many groveling begging letters asking them to reduce their prices, and in many cases, they've gone along with that. So, in general, I've been able to keep the prices reasonable, but I would say that in the main, I am probably operating at a deficit, which means that for me to do these anthologies, I have to do it out of love, not out of greed.
Which essays did you know for certain, because of that love, would be in this collection? I mean, you must have, when you were proposing this idea, known, I will include this, this, and this, or however many it might be. Were there essays in here that were just longtime favorites that you knew would be foundational?
Well, I'm an Emersonian. I love Emerson, and I do think that he's the most important essayist of the 19th century. And I think that James Baldwin is the most important essayist of the 20th century. So you can believe that I would include both of them. And then I had written a whole book about Susan Sontag, Notes on Sontag. And so I was very familiar with her work, and I knew that I would include her. And then there were essayists who I love, who I don't think people would automatically assume I would include, like Lauren Isley, the science writer. And so I was happy to include Isley. And then there were lots of essayists who I pretty much knew I would include, like Mary McCarthy or Joan Didion. But the joy was finding people who I didn't know about that much, like John J. Chapman or Randolph Bourne or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you know, who wrote this great essay on the solitude of self at a moment when the suffragettes and feminism of the 19th century was coming to a head.
So, did you discover works that you weren't familiar with at all while putting this together?
Absolutely. I mean, including figures who were very popular in the day, essayists like Agnes Repplier or Catherine Guiraud, who I had no idea about, you know. But the more you read, the more you see that one directs you to another and to another and to another. And so finally, you know, you get to discover things. And that was really part of the pleasure of doing these anthologies.
Okay, I have to ask you just a couple questions about the second collection in this trilogy, The Golden Age of the American Essay, 1945 to 1970. Why that period? What makes it a golden age?
It was a particularly hospitable period for the essay form. There were lots of literary journals and magazines, and even the non-literary journals, you know, like Esquire and Playboy, were featuring serious essays. It was also a period, I think, when America had proven victorious after World War II, and there was a sense that writers needed to take its temperature and see what the issues of America needed to face, you know, and these included things like racism and sexism and nuclear disarmament and so on, you know. So it was a period that was begging to be considered thoughtfully, you know. And so, you know, it was this combination of all of the media that were asking for it, a middle class that was suddenly expanding in education and wanting tips about how to think about things. You know, the colleges and universities were expanding. You had programs like Sunrise Semester that ordinary people were trying to find out what to think about Stendhal or something like that. It was a period when experts were still trusted, let's say, and public intellectuals had a heyday at that time.
What is it about anthologies that is important? Why do all this work and put these together?
I think anthologies are a record of what's worth preserving, whether they're the assertion of a canon or simply a kind of way to start a conversation about what we need to carry on from the past to the present. They really are like an assortment of relics, you might say. And I love doing them because they bring out a different side of my personality. Because ordinarily, when I'm just reading or writing, I can be much more intolerant. But when I'm editing an anthology, I'm much more open to other temperaments and other voices.
Well, I have to say, these books are both very mind-opening. There's so much in here to read. The titles, again, are The Glorious American Essay, 100 Essays from Colonial Times to the Present, and more recently, The Golden Age of the American Essay, 1945 to 1970. They're both edited by Philip Lopate, our guest. Philip, thank you so much again for being here.
And thank you for having me.
Elizabeth Harris joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So right around now, every spring, people are usually gearing up for Book Expo, which is this big annual trade show that attracts thousands of people every year. It's librarians, independent booksellers, buyers for big chains, literary agents, publishers, press. And it's this big machine to get the word out about upcoming books in advance of the fall season, which is like the big season for publishing. Like that's when Barack Obama's book was released, came out last fall. But last year, the company that ran Book Expo called Reed Exposition canceled it because of COVID and then announced it was going to retire it for good. Attendance had been falling in recent years and it was expensive to participate in, which a lot of people didn't like. Apart from, the money you have to spend to be in the show or go to the show, you had to fly to New York and stay in a hotel and stuff like that adds up really quickly. So Reed says that Book Expo is canceled and the publishing industry gets really concerned because this big part of how they get the word out about their big fall books is just gone now. And so Publishers Weekly stepped in and said they're going to try and fill some of that void. And they aren't going to try and replace Book Expo outright. It was this like giant thing, but they're going to do a few of the things that the industry was most concerned about losing.
So Publishers Weekly, for those who don't know, is one of the major trade publications that's read by independent booksellers and chain bookstores and by librarians and anyone who's in the business of buying, selling, or covering books.
Totally. And, I never got to go to Book Expo. I've been covering books and publishing for like about a year, a little less than a year. But you've been, right? And I've heard about it. But can you tell me what it was like to be there? Was it really this like giant thing?
It was this giant thing, especially when I first started going there, which was probably, maybe 15, 18 years ago. When I first started going to BEA, it was before I came to the New York Times, but when I was writing for the Times and other places as a journalist, as a reviewer, as a cultural critic, it was a really great place to go to get a sense of what was happening in book culture, what was going on in the book world. And at that stage, I really mostly went to walk the floors of the Javits Center, which is this huge exhibition space in New York and is currently now really a vaccine site. But I can say that over the years, you couldn't help notice that the space that each major publisher was taking up on the floor got noticeably smaller and smaller and smaller. And that was a little bit depressing to see. And some publishers opted not to take out space on the floor anymore. But back in the day, you would walk the floor and there would be authors and there were signings and you could see huge displays of each publisher's lineup for the fall. It really gave you a good sense of this is what's happening in the book world. These are the people, these are the authors, the books, the subjects that we're all going to be talking about, thinking about, reading about, writing about in the next year. And so that was very useful just as a reporter to kind of get a sense up ahead of what was going to be happening and people you might want to profile and trends you might be spotting. And there was a lot of excitement in the hall. There were constantly long lines for people to sign books. People gave talks. And one of the major things that would go on were two big breakfasts, the author breakfast and the children's books author breakfast, and then panels, notably buzz panels, which was a huge deal to get your book selected for a buzz panel. And that meant that editors were sort of pitching their books and the editors would have a chance to get up and talk about books they were excited about, or the authors would have a chance. And there were also some panels about things that were going on in the industry. So that was very useful. Now, once you're really working in the media covering books the way we do at the New York Times Book Review, when you go to the Javits Center, you kind of already know all of the books that are coming out. And so in more recent years, what I found to be most interesting was this was a time where you could really connect with booksellers, book buyers, librarians, get a sense of what they're excited about. So that was also really useful. They read books even further ahead than we do at the New York Times. So you often can glean a lot of information from what they're talking about. And I remember at the last BEA, the book that was on everyone's list and people were just wildly enthusing about was American Dirt, Janine Cummings' book, which became a bit controversial after it came out, but at that time was just the subject of enormous enthusiasm from booksellers across the country. So it's just an interesting read on what books people are excited about and what they're looking forward to. And it's probably the earliest indicator that you can get of a book success, because these are people who are going to end up hand selling books and generating the kind of word of mouth that gets a book like American Dirt to become a bestseller for weeks on end. So I'll miss that, and I will miss the buzz panels, and I will miss the parties, which are, really fun. And again, another opportunity to interact with a lot of people from across the industry. So all that is gone. So Liz, what's going to happen this year instead?
They're going to have 140 virtual booths, which is trying to recreate what you were talking about, like walking the floors and seeing what books everyone's got coming and what they're excited about. And then they'll have panels with famous people. Oprah has a book that just came out, and Keanu Reeves co-wrote a graphic novel called Berserker, and he's doing a panel with his co-author and their illustrator. The novelist Anthony Doerr is going to speak. Elizabeth Warren will talk about her new children's book. But they will not be replacing the parties, unfortunately. The parties are gone, which is sad. Maybe one day.
Yes, definitely. Let's see the parties again. Liz, they have to have you at these parties.
I would love to go to these parties.
All right. Liz, thanks again for being here.
Thanks so much.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and Gul Beckerman. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Let's start with you, Greg. What are you reading right now?
I'm reading The Committed by Viet Thanh Nguyen. This is a sequel to his debut novel, The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize back in 2015, I think. It's a big, boisterous comic novel. You don't have to have read The Sympathizer to get anything out of this book. It totally stands alone. But it picks up with the same character, who is a half French and half Vietnamese. In the earlier book, he was a communist spy for the Vietnamese during the war. And this one is set in the early 1980s in Paris. And it turns into a crime novel. Actually, he gets involved in the Paris underground in a way that keeps reminding me more than anything of the Saul Bellow novel, The Adventures of Augie March, where it's another story of an outsider who gets involved in the underground. And the plot is almost incidental to just the brio of the character's voice and observations and travels with prostitutes and bartenders and bouncers. And, for a time he's cleaning toilets in the restaurant owned by the boss of the underground, who's also Vietnamese. And so as soon as you know that it's about a Vietnamese man in France in the 1980s, it becomes a book very much about colonization and the Vietnamese relationship to the French. It is incredibly charming and incredibly acerbic in ways. The narrator, who was a communist spy, was also a double agent. He's not really committed to anything, so there's a lot of irony inherent in the title, The Committed. I think we're going to find out later that he has been committed to an asylum. And so there's a lot about the flaws with taking a stand, with holding an ideal position. And instead, he's always straddling the line and just watching it all. You read this book for the joy of the voice and the comedy. He's very jaundiced. And he's just got great observations. The first time you meet the crime boss, you hear about the part in his hair that's so neat it could hold a pencil. In describing Paris for the first time, he says the whole city looks like it was designed by Yves Saint Laurent. He talks about the relationship with the Vietnamese to their French colonizers. I'll read just a couple sentences here. Some of us ignored the insults, wanting only for our masters to love us. Some of us could not forget the insults and wanted to slay our masters. And some of us, me and myself most of all, loved and hated our masters at the same time. And that's the voice here. It's this tortured love-hate thing going on, not just with the French and colonization, but with the world. And it's a voice where you just ride along with it. Later in the book, he's dealing drugs for this crime boss, and he gets into kind of warfare with the Algerian drug dealers in France. And again, that's the colonization. And so it's a book that contains all these themes just inherent in the story, but you gallop along and forget about the themes and just read it for the voice and the story. The first novel in this sequence of novels that he's writing, The Sympathizer, is set partly in Vietnam and partly in Southern California, which is where Viet Nguyen lives. And because of the Southern California thing, there's a lot more about America and its relationship to Vietnam and the war, and the way especially the American media has portrayed the Vietnam War and Vietnamese in general. And this book moves away from all of that. He's come to France from a refugee camp in Indonesia after fleeing Saigon by boat. So he is a boat person, in a term that the French have stolen from the Americans. And it leaves aside all of the media and Hollywood criticism that was inherent in the first book, and instead is looking much more at the Vietnamese-French relationship. Gal, what are you reading?
So, the pandemic has found me living in Los Angeles unexpectedly, and I've sort of been going through the canon of LA noir. And so I've now come up against Raymond Chandler, who I've been wanting to read for a long time. And I've been reading his first novel, The Big Sleep, from 1939. And it's something. I mean, you kind of see where our whole long tradition of hard-boiled detectives comes from, because this is where we first meet the character of Philip Marlowe. I wish I could give you a tight synopsis of this book, but this book is famously convoluted. The plot doesn't seem to be the point. I think, much like your book, Greg, it's about the voice, but a very different sort of voice, probably in this case. It's this sardonic, witty, dry voice of the detective, Marlowe, who, when the book starts off, he's asked by a millionaire who's being blackmailed to take on a case. Marlowe then meets the millionaire's two daughters, who are each sort of femme fatales in different ways. And the plot takes off. The writing is just so taut and economical. There's really just 3 pages don't pass without a gun being drawn or a dead body showing up. He's just piling it on. There's no, this is not ton of French. There's no psychology. There's no extraneous personal, what he probably would think of as extraneous personal detail or context. It's just Marlowe moving his way through this story. But you're so drawn by his voice, and you literally, I could flip to any page here and there would be the gem of just observation. Here's an example. Literally, I'm just flipping to a page. She bit her lip and turned her head a little and looked at me along her eyes. Then she lowered her lashes until they almost cuddled her cheek and slowly raised them again like a theater curtain. I was to get to know that trick. This was supposed to make me roll over on my back with all 4 paws in the air. And it's like you can't actually read. You can't read it without hearing that voice in that noir narrator voice from the movies that we've gotten to know so well.
Is this? I mean, he really invented this whole genre, right?
I don't know if he was the first to come up with this idea of the tortured lone detective, but I understand that he really owned it after he did it. He was working in the tradition is maybe too high-minded a word for it, but there was a whole world of pulp magazines at the time. And Chandler, who was a sort of struggling writer, this was his way of breaking in. The irony is that, you get a sense that he's piling on all of this plot, like there's, you meet one gangster and then you think you're following that line, and then you meet another gangster and then somebody else shows up dead. And really by the end, you cannot keep track. And so I think he's doing that almost in a frantic effort to keep the reader committed to the book, but it's really not the plot at all. That's what's so compelling about it. It's just Marlowe, and you want to know more about the mystery of who this guy is.
Here's my question for either of you or for our listeners if you don't know the answer, which is I'm curious about the etymology of the phrase hard-boiled crime. And does anyone ever write like a devastating review of one of these kinds of novels that calls it like a soft scramble crime? Or, how did we get there?
Sunny side up. I don't know. And now that you say that, I can't really even ponder a guess as to like what that should mean with regards to Marlowe, except that he's impervious to the slings and arrows. He's just going through life very toughened, and nothing amuses him. At some point he shows up in his apartment and one of the 2 daughters of the millionaire who's hired him is naked in his bed. And he just sort of like takes out a cigarette, pours himself a scotch and soda. And he's like, giving it to the count of 3 to get out of here, kid. He's just nothing phases him. So maybe that's what hard-boiled means.
Right. Less like a boiled egg and more like a boiled side of beef. He's like leathery.
Pamela, what are you reading?
I'm going to talk about 2 books that I recently read, and I have to say, neither of which I loved unreservedly, and I'll explain why. And I will probably surprise people that the second book I'll talk about is the newest from Emmanuel Carrere, which
And you don't love
normally
it?
I love, love, love. I'll explain. But I'll talk first about this other book I read called Beijing Payback by Daniel Nye. I bring this one up first because I think it shares in common with both of the books you each read, which is this gritty underworld setting. And I have come to realize over time, I realized it first in film and then later in books, I don't like the gritty underworld. It's a thriller. It's a crime thriller. It's kind of a millennial dude novel, which is something I don't love. And it's a debut novel. And the main character is this college student. So already, I'm in trouble because I don't like youth. This college student, Victor Lee, whose father is murdered. His father owns a group of Chinese restaurants in LA. So maybe this is your next LA book, Gal. And he and his sister, Jules, are grappling with the death when bad things happen, when the father's will is revealed. And in short order, our hero is off to Beijing, where everyone is evil and or very attractive. Even the dorky people are cool in this book. Sort of everyone is cool. And there are interesting drugs and crazy nightclubs. And it's just, you can hear propulsive music. As our former colleague, Elida Becker would put it, it's not my cup of tea. I don't want to be in a nightclub, with interesting drugs and pounding music. I just want to be at home on a sofa. So my favorite part of the book had to do with Daniel Nye used to be a translator, a Chinese English translator. Maybe he still does that, an interpreter. And he works in some of that into the book. And though I only took 1 year of Mandarin and promptly forgot nearly everything, I kind of enjoyed his discussions around tones. And he will sometimes transliterate Chinese and then write it in English. And I can pick out the, 3 or 4 words that I still remember. So I enjoyed that part. And actually, maybe that's the perfect transition to the other book that I want to talk about, which is also not about translation, but actually was written in French and has not yet been translated here. And Gal, I'm happy that you're here because fulfilling all the worst expectations people would have about the staff of the book review, you started up this Francophone book club among our
we're
colleagues.
About to alienate everybody. And
yes.
But you should quickly say that the French in this book was a very accessible, I think you called it baby French at some point.
Yeah. It's true. I was very nervous about this undertaking because I speak French, but I don't really read French. And in fact, I think I talked about this on the podcast maybe 6 or 7 years ago when I was reading Les Miserables, the Victor Hugo novel, that I stopped reading books by French authors after my 20s, when I did read a little bit in French for French literature classes I used to take at the Alliance Française. I stopped reading after that because out of laziness and fatigue and, general sense of mental decline, I felt that if I wasn't going to read a book by a French author, I would have to read it in French. And as a consequence, I read nothing for a good 15 years. And I only recently started picking up some of classic French novels in translation, Hugo, and going back to Balzac and Zola. But I had not still read any books in French until this book. And I actually took out my old French-English dictionary, which I still have from high school, even though I am aware there are more modern technologies available. It was almost, I don't know, it was I felt like I was going to be in high school. And to my surprise, I really didn't need the dictionary. And I was feeling pretty smug and proud of myself, although also confused. When we met, though, there was, I think, 5 of us in this group. It turned out none of us needed our dictionaries. It was just incredibly accessible. Part of that, too, may have been the fact that he does not write using the passé simple, which, of course, is a verb tense that appears only in French literature and so is a kind of stumbling block for, I think, a lot of people who might be fluent in French and sort of spoken French, but get bewildered by that verb tense. Anyway, I want to say that while I said up front that I didn't unreservedly love this book, I adored reading it. I just rushed right through it. I absolutely loved this book until the ending. And it's not the fact that there was something wrong with the ending, but it was about something that I only realized when I was done with the book, which is called Yoga, where he reveals that not everything in the book is true. And he tells you certain things that aren't true, but you're sort of left on shaky ground, wondering, wait, was that part true? Was this thing true? And the worst part of it is that the things that weren't true, there was one thing that I was like, okay, I'm fine with that not being true, which had to do with an affair that he was having. But there was another whole story with a woman he meets on an island in a Syrian refugee camp in Greece. I hope I'm interesting people in this, at least to read it when it comes out, either when it's out now in French or when it's translated into English, which it will be next year by FSG, because it is worth reading. But he meets this woman on this island in Greece where there's a Syrian refugee camp, and he tells this brilliant and incredible story about this woman's twin sister. And incredible indeed, because it turns out that it's not true. I felt gravely disappointed by this. Gal, how did you feel?
Yeah, no, I shared your disappointment, and I think that it was particularly undermining because the tone of the book is so completely intimate. The book shifts. It starts off with Carrere going to a Vipassana retreat, to one of these silent meditation retreats for, I think, 10 days. And you're just so much inside his head. And then as you move through the book, he also ends up having a kind of a mental breakdown and finding himself in an institution and getting electroshock therapy. So you're moving with him through these very intense moments of his mental life. And so I think particularly with a story like that, to know that a lot of things were made up feels a bit of a betrayal. I think what really keeps me like loving this book, maybe more than you, Pamela, I don't know, but his struggle to be present was illustrated in a way that I can't remember reading, like an artist really feeling that difficulty of just that voice always in his head, both kind of narrating the world around him, but also pushing him towards being more ambitious, towards achieving more, and just trying to fight that off so he can actually create. That struggle felt so real in this book that it allowed me to overlook a lot of what he was doing. Also, we should mention that part of the constraint towards being completely truthful in this book had to do with a lawsuit involving his now ex-wife, who didn't want any part of herself or her story or her name even to appear in any of his books, and stipulated that legally. And so I think she was in this story. In real life, she was in a lot of these stories in a much bigger way, and he couldn't do that. So he had to sort of write around it. And maybe that's what led to him having to make up so much.
Yes, that is true and should be borne in mind. And I agree with you. I absolutely loved the parts about yoga and meditation and mindfulness, and whether it's desirable, to totally detach yourself. And if you're in the moment, right? If you're in the moment 100%, you're letting go of thinking about it, then you cannot write about it. You can't be writing about it because the writer in you would be constantly on the outside narrating what's happening. And it's incredibly difficult if you have that impulse at all to get rid of that narrating voice, right? It's there hovering. And so it's a really interesting
Like he describes sitting and doing meditation in this retreat, and he's already telling himself what the story is going to be about him being at this retreat, while he's there. And I empathize so much with that, with that dilemma.
Yes. I have a lot to say about that too, but I'll reserve it to one book related thing, which is my other favorite description of being at a meditation yoga retreat is Spalding Gray. I don't know if either of you have read his descriptions of going up to this Zendo in upstate New York, but he's a little bit more humorous, although there are funny parts in the Emmanuel Carrere about that. But these are my two favorite books about that. And I also found the writing around his mental breakdown really fascinating. He gets diagnosed as bipolar at age 59, which is true and shocking, really surprising. And it made me want to go back and reread all of his earlier works, with that knowledge and see what I might view differently as a consequence. All right, let's run down the books that we read again. Greg?
I'm reading The Committed by Viet Thanh Nguyen.
And I'm reading Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep.
And I read Beijing Payback by Daniel Nye and Yoga by Emmanuel Carrere. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.